I'm Catherine McGrady, the CEO of CNA, and this is CNA Talks.
When Kabul fell, it did so without a shot being fired. The Taliban walked into power as the country's president, Ashraf Ghani, fled the country, but they don't have access to all the levers of power, including billions of dollars held overseas.
75% of the previous government's budget came from foreign grants. And since August, donors such as the US have refused to bankroll a state led by the Taliban.
In the face of economic hardship, Taliban administration is expanding its Food for Work program. Under the program, donated wheat is used to pay thousands of public sector employees instead of cash.
Hello, welcome to this edition of CNA Talks, episode 104. I'm Jonathan Schroden, Director of CNA's Countering Threats and Challenges program, and today we'll be discussing the current situation in Afghanistan. To briefly bring our listeners up to speed, last year we saw the fall of the Western-backed government in Kabul in the wake of a countrywide Taliban offensive concurrent with a precipitous withdrawal of U.S. and coalition forces. Since the Taliban takeover in August, conditions have markedly deteriorated across Afghanistan. These negative trends are in part a result of the policies and incompetence of the Taliban government so far, and in part a result of sanctions imposed by the United States, United Nations, and others on the Taliban government, as well as on some specific members of it. These sanctions have severely impaired the ability of Afghanistan's central bank to function and have led to nationwide shortages of hard currency, as well as significant inflation and declining value of the Afghani against foreign currencies such as the dollar. These conditions, coupled with a terrible drought in Afghanistan last year and the onset of winter, have led to a humanitarian crisis of epic scale in the country. UNICEF has estimated that up to 1 million Afghan children are at risk of death by starvation this winter, and the UN has estimated that up to 97% of Afghans could be below the universal poverty line by this summer. While the U.S. has taken some recent steps, such as allowing certain aid exemptions to its sanctions and pledging $308 million in additional humanitarian assistance for Afghanistan, the UN has called for global donations to the tune of $4.4 billion in emergency aid to keep the country afloat. Amidst this crisis, researchers from the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point recently published data showing that the Islamic State is regaining strength in Afghanistan, having conducted more than twice as many attacks in that country in 2021 as in any previous year. And the UN monitoring team's report from last week stated that groups such as Al-Qaeda are operating with more freedom in Afghanistan, albeit still with a low profile, since the Taliban's conquest of the country. With me today to discuss these pressing issues are two well-recognized experts. Torek Farhadi is a frequent discussant on economic, humanitarian, and security issues in Afghanistan, with a particular focus on inclusive trade development through education, upgrading skills, and generating access to finance, especially for women and young people. He was previously a senior advisor at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Torek, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here.
Also with us is Dr. Bill Byrd. He's a developmental economist with the U.S. Institute of Peace. He was previously with the World Bank, to include being stationed in Kabul from 2002 to 2006 as the bank's country manager for Afghanistan. He's written two recent reports for USIP that focus specifically on the economic crisis in Afghanistan. Bill, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So, Bill, I'd like to start with you if I could. In early January, you wrote a paper with USIP that was titled How to Mitigate Afghanistan's Economic and Humanitarian Crises, that featured, at least in my view, some very practical things that could be done to help with the situation that I described. I'm wondering if you would mind summarizing for our listeners some of the ideas you had for addressing the crises in Afghanistan today.
Sure, happy to do so, and happy to be on this podcast. Just to underline a couple of quick points at the beginning. One, the cutoff of $8 billion in foreign assistance to Afghanistan was really the triggering shock in a lot of these developments and the humanitarian economic crisis. These sanctions themselves further exacerbated the situation, but the fundamental economic shock, almost globally unprecedented, was loss of about 40% of GDP of aid that was terminated after August 15th. I'd also like to just emphasize that we're really going into the worst of it now with the lean season during the winter, when people's resources have dried up and the risks are very much there. In terms of what to be done about it, nothing can offset the economic shock, but there are ways to mitigate the impact, at least to some extent. And in my paper, I highlighted two urgent concerns, one related to the foreign banks' unwillingness or inability to transfer funds into Afghanistan, and the second one, the liquidity problem in Afghanistan itself, which you alluded to, but to which I would add that there's also a shortage of Afghani currency because the foreign company that was printing these banknotes in the past is not printing them anymore due to the fear of sanctions. So those are the two areas where something needs to be done. Now, most recently, in December 22nd, the Treasury came out with some further sanctions relief, expanding and clarifying, and then most recently with some frequently asked questions, which specifically said that foreign banks are allowed to transfer humanitarian aid funds into Afghanistan. We'll see if that works. I am a little bit skeptical because I think there's just a tremendous amount of risk aversion among foreign banks over any kind of dealing with Afghanistan, even if it's officially authorized by Treasury, for example. So I think that's an area that needs further work. And then on the liquidity problem, the UN has been shipping in goodly amounts of cash US dollars, which is of some help. And there is a need to figure out what to do about the printing Afghani banknotes. A humanitarian exchange is in the works, whereby the money that Afghan businesses like telecoms agencies and other large businesses are keeping to themselves would be freed up to be deposited in UN accounts and banks in return for a swap with foreign currency being provided to those same private enterprises accounts in the Middle East. So that may be beginning to happen soon on a pilot basis. There are also some very interesting and potentially positive ways of working with digital currency and mobile money that should be explored. The penetration of telecommunication, mobile telecom in Afghanistan is fairly great. And this would be a way to also ease the liquidity constraint and get money to the people who need it in digital form or mobile e-form. But looking beyond these two immediate constraints and trying to save lives with the humanitarian aid, there is a need to also look more broadly at the Afghan economy and what can be done to at least partially stabilize it. And that gets into issues of the banking system, what kind of central bank functions would be taken out and where, whether it's possible to provide relief from sanctions for commercial imports. For example, if somebody wants to build a factory that provides masks for COVID or other kinds of medical equipment, that should be also relief from sanctions. If the private sector collapses and if the banking system collapses, that is going to add to the already extremely large humanitarian needs. And then finally, I'll just mention the issue of service delivery, which was handled in some ways efficiently in the past, particularly in the basic program of health services. And those kind of service delivery programs need to be maintained, but in a cost-effective way. And obviously not at the moment being channeled through the Taliban government, but handled cost-effectively with NGOs.
Thanks, Bill. I really appreciate that. A really helpful overview to get us started. Torek, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this as well. You know, ideas that you might have for practical things that the U.S., other countries, or really any group or individual could do to help alleviate the suffering in Afghanistan today.
Bill, covered it pretty well. In fact, now it's a liquidity crisis at several levels. At the level of the government itself, because it doesn't have the budget support that was coming to it during the previous regime. That budget support is no longer there. So at the government level, the liquidity comes from whatever the Taliban can collect from the customs revenues and some other small revenues from mining, as they say. So that's one level, the government liquidity crisis. There is a bank liquidity crisis. The banks don't have enough money. The only function they play right now is to disburse in small amounts, because the central bank has allowed the banks to give a limited amount to every account holder per week. And even for businesses and NGOs, they have trouble withdrawing funds, even if they have funds in their accounts. They have trouble withdrawing funds. And the banks are running out of liquidity in Afghanistan, except Afghan International Bank, which has the US dollars from the UN. The UN has said that it has at any moment between $35 to $130 million there, but it has trouble exchanging it into Afghanis. Of course, it has trouble because the banks don't have too much Afghanis left, and the UN is not allowed to go and exchange the US dollars with Afghanis at the central bank because of the sanctions. So the UN has to exchange this either in the market, either as Bill say, to make deals with telecom companies and other companies who collect cash from the public by selling telecom cards. And they can give this cash in Afghani to the UN, and then the UN can compensate with these companies. That's a sort of a limited solution, but the UN needs Afghani currency because when it gives cash aid to people, it has to be in Afghani because the central bank has forbidden the use of any foreign currencies in Afghanistan. So it's the liquidity crisis at the government level, liquidity crisis at the banks level, liquidity crisis at the private business level. At the private business level, private businesses are deprived of the ability to withdraw their cash from the banks. They are deprived of the ability of ordering letters of credits for imports, etc. Also, during the former regime, because the budget support included developmental aid, there are a bunch of projects run by the government, repairing roads, repairing government buildings or whatnot. They have stopped, and the private sector is complaining that they don't have those juicy government contracts. It's finished. The government doesn't have too much money. So the private sector is suffering on these three fronts. They can't withdraw their liquidity. They have lost the ability to order letters of credit, etc. And they have lost the government contracts, which are financed by donor funding under the development budget before. And then at the last level, the individual liquidity crisis, an estimated 500,000 people, and between 250,000 and 500,000 people have lost their jobs, including the woman, the famous woman, who have been asked to stay home, and the teachers, and they haven't been paid salaries, or if they have been paid in the 7 months, it has been very irregular. And in fact, even before the 7 months, they hadn't been paid for a couple of months. So let's not forget that the Afghan National Army, was it real, was it fake? But a number of people were being paid there by the US government. That also has disappeared. So that also has dried up quite a bit of liquidity inside Afghanistan. So we have at four levels crisis of liquidity.
I think it's actually a very inappropriate and counterproductive policy on the part of the central bank to not allow dollar transactions, because that means the liquidity that's being brought in the form of cash dollars can't be used easily. The dollar is widely accepted in Afghanistan, so a lot of payments could be made in dollars, and then the recipient and beneficiary could, either convert them or keep them. One other point on the banking sector is approximately $900 million of Afghanistan's foreign exchange reserves, which are currently frozen, is attributable to Afghan banks' foreign exchange reserves that they deposited with the central bank. So in terms of improving liquidity and helping preserve the banking system, releasing that portion directly to the banks would be an option that might be attractive, and it doesn't involve giving the funds to the Taliban.
Bill, I'd like to come back to you for a minute if I could. The more recent article that you published with USIP looked at the 3-month budget that the Taliban have proposed and did some analysis of that. And one of the things I found interesting in your discussion of it is you noted that border collection revenues are seemingly on the rise, or at least the government seems to be collecting more of that revenue, perhaps due to reduced corruption at the border collection posts. And as I think back to the comments that both you and Torek made earlier about the massive reduction in aid revenue to the country as being one of the major precipitating factors of all of this, I wonder, when you look at the increased border revenues, do you see the potential there to offset any of the crises that we've talked about in the short term, or is the scale of those revenues just not going to be enough?
Afghanistan's total revenues in the past were on the order of $2 to $2.5 billion a year. The best sort of available estimate for a full year amount now would be 1.2 to 1.5 billion. So it's a lot less. Even customs revenues are less than in the past, but they've performed considerably better in relation to the sharp decline in imports. So the available information we have suggests the Taliban collected about $400 million in the 3 months from September 21st to December 21st. So it's certainly not going to offset the huge loss of aid.
Oh, thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. For our listeners, we're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back with another question for Torek.
Hi, listeners. I'm Nalanthi Samaranayaka, the director of CNA's Strategy and Policy Analysis Program. We study issues ranging from maritime strategy to managing alliances and nuclear policy. We've expanded our work in the past few years to include Arctic strategy and policy analysis and the study of non-traditional security issues, such as women, peace and security, climate change and strategic partnerships, and ocean security. If you're interested in learning more about our work, please check out our webpage, cna.org/strategy.
Torek, I had a question for you next, if you don't mind. There's about, at least to my understanding, roughly $9 billion in sovereign Afghanistan funds that the U.S. has frozen in the wake of the Taliban's conquest of the country. And I've seen quite a bit on Twitter, people using a hashtag unfreeze Afghanistan, effectively calling for the U.S. to remove its freeze on those funds and to allow Afghanistan, the Taliban government, and the banks there to access those funds again. And I know there are some legal issues that are wound up in this, but I'm curious your thoughts on, if the U.S. were to unfreeze those assets, how much of a difference would they make with respect to the crises that we've talked about so far?
Let me address the question from an economic standpoint. Releasing $9 billion at once could create its own set of risks and hazards, I would say, at least without any technical assistance, etc., on how for it to be spent, because then nobody has control. Yes, the 9 billion or 9.5 billion, the 7 billion of it are in the US, subject to a lawsuit as well. And then 2.5 or 2 billion are in Europe, actually, which would be perhaps at first step release. The NGOs are asking for such type of relief. But then some other people are saying this shouldn't be given to NGOs because these are the central bank reserves. We have to see how it can be dealt with, because then the Taliban would be very upset that the central bank reserves were released to NGOs. So that wouldn't really work out. For the listeners, the reason, one of the reasons it's frozen also is because the Taliban are under sanctions. So one proposal was to make the central bank completely apolitical, take the Taliban out of the central bank and have it managed by a group of technocrats. And then release tranches of this money so that the central bank can regain its functions. And also the $900 million that Bill was talking about, which is really the private banks' reserves at the central bank, which have ended up in the US. If those are released, also the private banks would be in a better situation. That's very important because one way also to jumpstart the economy is to ask the private banks to make loans, finally. Business loans, loans for women and youth. But right now, if we ask the private banks to make loans, what they say is with which liquidity? So yes, we have to really work to avoid the collapse of the private banks. There are private banks which are doing very well, Afghan International Bank, because now it's supported by a stream of dollars from the UN. And there also, it's very strange that the UN has chosen to single source all of this work to one bank out of 9 or 12 banks. But then there are other banks which might collapse because of lack of liquidity. So it is urgent for everyone involved to recapitalize these banks, or at least give them back what they had with the central bank so that they can start functioning as a normal bank. So that part is important. And also, unfreezing amounts of the money, which is sovereign money, should be done to pay the bills with import bills of electricity. Afghanistan owes money to Uzbekistan, about $60 million to $80 million for electricity. Afghanistan owes money, they just paid $6 or $7 million to Tajikistan. It's importing its energy, it's importing oil and pharmaceutical products as well. So it's in a tough spot. It would create some liquidity, preferably if apolitical technocrats was acceptable to the US government and to the Taliban in the middle to do this office work, basically to manage this released tranches of money for transaction and liquidity purposes. It would improve the situation in the country. And this has to be done carefully because who says lots of liquidity says inflation. Already there is inflation because of the food prices, etc. So once the decision is made to release tranches of this money to sort of a central office, which is not political, which can act like a central bank, then the management of it becomes an issue. It has to be done carefully, not to create imbalances in the economy.
No, thanks. I really appreciate that. Bill, could I ask maybe your thoughts on the same question, but I'm also curious the extent to which you think we will actually see donations to Afghanistan at or even approaching the $4.4 billion call from the UN?
Sure. Well, I'll start on the reserves. I mean, as Torek also knows, what would have been done before August 15th? Well, the government had an IMF program in place most of the time. That would then kind of supervise or monitor how much reserves are being used to deal with a balance of payments issue. And certainly the previous government would not have viably stayed on the IMF program if they had, misused or used large amounts of reserves. So the whole point of reserves is to manage the balance of payments and macroeconomic adjustment. And by the way, the size of the reserves, which is larger than many other countries, is a sign of the previous government's sound macroeconomic management. So there are a lot of issues there, which you touched on, also the legal case, but it's really difficult to see a way forward. But these reserves basically were built up by the Afghan state representing the Afghan people, and that's where they should be responsibly managed. On the 4.4 billion, I'd just like to add a minor correction. It's actually 8 billion in the most recent UN framework. 4.4 billion is the purely humanitarian aid, and then another 3.6 billion is related to service delivery and basic needs kinds of focused development aid. So we're talking about 8 billion requests from the UN plus another 600 million requested for Afghan refugees and Afghans in neighboring countries. So this is really an enormous request. And just to highlight that, this 8 billion is about the same as total aid to Afghanistan was in the previous years, but more than half of that was security assistance. So it's more than twice the level of civilian aid in the past. And even just the non-purely humanitarian part of aid, the 3.6 billion, is equal to total civilian assistance in the past. So this is a highly unrealistic request in my view.
Torek, a question for you. So One of the ways that one could imagine dealing with the liquidity crisis, or at least trying to mitigate it, would be remittances from Afghans living abroad. And I know that used to be a fair amount of money that would flow into Afghanistan in the past. Have we seen any indications of the Afghan diaspora being able to provide remittances to help family and friends or just their fellow Afghans with any of these problems that we've talked about?
Yes, there is. It was cut off at the beginning because all the money transfer services cut off their services in Afghanistan. But now it's timidly starting again. I think in the previous years, some years, remittances reached $700 million. And it was going mostly to the free market, and it was going from Afghans who are in the Gulf. There's lots of Afghans working in Kuwait, UAE, Saudi Arabia. It was Afghans from the United States. I don't know the exact number, but at least there are 300,000 Afghans to 400,000 Afghans in the United States, perhaps today. And then there are Afghans in Europe as well, to the tune of 150,000. Everyone's sending a little bit of money, can help, has helped. It has to be encouraged, by the way, by the authorities in Afghanistan to encourage Afghans to send back money to their families. It is a good solution. It puts money directly in the hands of families, which is where it's needed exactly. And there is no other intermediary, just the money transfer system. And some people can also send remittances for their family members to start a small business. On the topic of the UN asking for $8 billion, the UN has never really managed $8 million in any country at this amount, and especially without any type of consultation with the population in place. These are decisions being made by bureaucrats in New York, and they're not having any consultations with the Taliban because they don't recognize the Taliban. They are not having any consultations with anyone other than the donors. And there is no evaluation mechanism. There is no supervision mechanism. And the UN traditionally likes to be evaluated by the UN. So the UN has gone to Japan and asked some money from Japan for the UNDP to evaluate what the UN is doing. This doesn't make sense to me. There has to be third-party evaluation of what the UN is doing, how it's planning to spend all of this money. Is it efficient? There are noises from Afghanistan that the aid that's being said to be distributed doesn't arrive at destination, not because of the Taliban, but because of shortcomings from the UN. And right now, the UN has the upper hand in communication because it can collect the money from the donors, and it says we have arrived at serving X number of millions of people. But those number of millions of people are saying in the Afghan media they haven't received much. So a third-party evaluation mechanism is very important to at least give a report to the UN how they are doing, and to the donors, and to the people of Afghanistan. I have never seen the international finance institutions, of which the UN is one in this case, work in a country without asking the beneficiary how it should be spent.
Just to add one quick point on the remittances, because I think that's a very good point. But first, that's how the Afghan economy survived the previous Taliban regime and the previous civil war and occupation. Remittances coming from Afghans into the country prevented a serious drought and prevented the effects of conflict from resulting in mass starvation. So remittances are really important, but they're also subject to the liquidity crisis, and their remittances through the formal banking system. There are limits on how much someone can withdraw from the remittances that they receive. There is also the informal Havala market, which is efficient and effective, but it probably will have problems with scaling if the amounts get too large.
Bill, could I turn to you and ask a question that really pertains more to optics on the U.S. side and some of the difficulties that I think the Biden administration has here, which is this idea that somehow our actions may benefit the Taliban, either directly or indirectly. And I wonder your views on how realistic it is to hold a view that we should not allow for any benefit to the Taliban, either directly or indirectly, from some of the types of solutions that you and Torek have talked about so far?
Well, since September, probably at the earliest, and definitely through the fall, I've been arguing for a risk management approach rather than a zero tolerance risk avoidance approach, which is actually because the zero risk option of the funding and aid being diverted to the Taliban is absolutely not realistic. We already have reports which are credible that Taliban are directing the distribution of food aid, and that's sort of the most basic humanitarian need. And so there's no guarantee that there would be no diversion, even for the most basic needs, food aid. And there's well documented studies in other countries how prolonged humanitarian crises in conflict countries, inevitably, the assistance indirectly or directly in part benefits some of the conflict actors. So I think it's a chimera to say you can actually have a zero tolerance policy. And so then the question was, do you do sensible risk management, including on the sanctions, maybe related to small amounts, and really judging the need for the assistance of different types and in different areas versus the risk of small amounts being diverted to the Taliban. One criterion that could be used is whether the diversion would materially support the Taliban in a significant way. I think that would be a criteria, and it would help cut through this issue. So there are ways to do it to minimize that risk. The third-party monitoring would be very good, which Torek suggested. And by the way, I would add in some of the key national programs in the past that was there, certainly in the basic public health program under the previous government and in others. So it's a normal practice with development aid and really should be followed for this kind of large request. I also agree that there really needs to be international financial institutions involved when the amounts of money get this large. They're at least used to handling and monitoring these kinds of amounts, whereas the UN, it's very much focused on implementation.
Oh, thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. If I could just ask one quick question of both of you, would be, and I'll start with Torek, are there any positive trends that you could point to right now that might provide even a glimmer of hope for alleviation of these crises? Or do you think that we're really in for the types of dire predictions that we've heard from the likes of the UN?
I think the positive is that security is relatively good. Even the UN itself went to see the Ministry of Interior to tell them thank you for the security, and the UNSCF has said that for the first time they have been able to go to all the corners of Afghanistan and distribute aid without any problems. So that is good. There is security, but now we have to give people food and then opportunities for livelihoods. I think we have to take big steps politically to see what we can do on sanctions relief, on how the government can be recognized so it can print currency, because we are dollarizing the economy inside the banks. But then if we want to help people and distribute money, it has to be given in Afghani, and then there's not enough Afghanis, or there are not enough new Afghanis. The government has to have the ability to print at least limited amounts of new money to help the economy, to pay the salaries.
Yeah, sure. Bill, your thoughts on that too, please.
One thing that's positive was the Taliban putting out a 3-month budget, which is reasonably balanced. It doesn't assume any foreign assistance directly to the Afghan budget, which is prudent and realistic in my view. And they are collecting, as I mentioned, significant amounts of revenue. In fact, the revenue that's being collected probably would pay the civilian government employees' salary bill and perhaps some of the other recurrent costs. So given the demise of the ANDSF, there's no need to pay them. The revenues, even though they're lower, potentially would be enough to pay civil servants' salaries, including teacher. This then raises the question of why the UN is asking for $900 million for education, which must include teacher salary because it's such a really large amount, and raises the issue of then if the international community pays teachers' salaries, that frees up resources in the Taliban budget for other uses such as security and justice or other things. This is yet another reason why you really need to get the IFIs involved on macroeconomic dialogue and fiscal situations to make sure that the limited aid, much more limited, will be coming through than the $8 billion is used to the best effect.
Well, thank you very much to Bill Byrd and to Torek Farhadi for joining us today. I have learned an enormous amount by listening to both of you, and I hope our listeners will read your papers and follow you on Twitter because you both have quite a lot of really useful insights on these issues. So with that, I'll thank our listeners for joining us today. I'm Jon Schroden, and this is CNA Talks.
Thanks for listening to CNA Talks. The views expressed are those of the commentators and do not necessarily reflect those of CNA or any of its sponsors. CNA Talks is produced, edited, and mixed by John Stimson. Our theme music is by Edward Grenga. If you enjoy our show, we'd love if you could give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends about us. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.